Arletha Best was barely in her 20s when her marriage ended, leaving this God-fearing young woman a single mother of 2 children. She struggled but kept the faith that life would get better. She attended church like she did every Sunday morning, with her daughters right beside her, when she noticed there was an unfamiliar face sitting in the pew next to her. She'd never seen him before. He was handsome, she thought. They smiled at one another, and Sunday service began. She would glance at him during the service. She could tell that he was enjoying the word as much as she was. After the service ended, he would introduce himself. Anthony Hopkins, who was currently serving in the U.S. Army. It didn't take much, but after that first meeting, the 2 were inseparable, or should I say, the 4 were inseparable. Anthony didn't mind at all that Arletha had 2 daughters from a previous marriage. He didn't have any children, but he prayed one day that he would. Anthony Hopkins was everything that Arletha had prayed for. She thought that he was sent from heaven. He was definitely sent from somewhere. The 2 enjoyed music, dancing. Though both were young, they shared in the same dreams and aspirations to serve God. For richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, according to God's holy law and the presence of God, I make this vow. It wasn't long before Arletha Best became Arletha Hopkins, and her 2 daughters, Chantel and Tasha, would share his last name too. The small family would move from Whately, Georgia to Jackson, Alabama. By this time, Chantel was 11 years old. Anthony would remove her from her 5th grade class. There would be no reasons to why. Anthony decided it would be better if she was homeschooled. Chantel and her younger sister Tasha would be homeschooled. Not long after, the family was back on the road, moving again, now to Mobile, Alabama. They stayed not that long. Then the Hopkins would move to New Orleans, Louisiana. It seemed the family was running from something, or should I say it seemed Anthony was running from something. They would continue to move, house to house, state to state, place to place. Finally, they would end one final move back to Mobile, Alabama, and the reasons of why the family had moved state to state so often. Anthony would be arrested in Saraland, Alabama, from reportedly going AWOL from the Army. The former paratrooper had managed to stay under the radar for several years. He had received orders to serve in Korea, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. He received higher orders from God, calling him to become an evangelist, and that's what he did. He would later say the Army wouldn't allow his family to move with him to Korea, other reasons of why he refused to go. It's unclear about how the Army handled Anthony's situation, but he became an evangelist. In the beginning of the Hopkins marriage, money was tight. Anthony worked as a nurse's aide and even in a mental health facility, but now Anthony wasn't working at all. Arletha would have jobs, but Anthony didn't want her to work. He would sometimes even start physical altercations with his wife, anything from stopping her from leaving the house. On one occasion during a fight, Arletha had scratched him. He called the police. He would tell the police his wife was belligerent while causing the injury. Of course, later dropping the charges and trying to control and scare her. Maybe next time, if she tried to leave, this time she would be hauled off to jail. Anthony was very controlling of his wife. He never wanted her to get close to any people. He had a need to try to control every aspect of her life. Arletha still kept in contact with her stepmother, Mary Bess. It's not certain how he felt about that, but we can guess. The neighbors would hear these fights that the couple would have, never wanting to get involved with that, but one thing a neighbor did get involved in was helping to feed the children. By now, several years in the marriage, the Hopkins had 5 additional children. Where Anthony was now homeschooling all 7 children. The neighbors would watch the children play in the front yard. They were not allowed to associate or play with any other children. There would be no outside influences. Some have said that Anthony, who some refer to as Reverend, would take all he could from someone. He used people. He would get all he could out of you and just discard you. Rumor has it, if you didn't give Anthony any money to help his family, he'd put a curse on you. He'd send letters letting you know that you were cursed. His followers called him a psychic, a prophet. People would come all over the surrounding areas of Mobile just to hear him speak on the streets. But this was not bringing in any money. Arletha would stand by her husband while he did the Lord's work. On one particular day, while the traveling evangelist was preaching, there was a pastor in the crowd who would give Anthony an offer that he just couldn't refuse, and Anthony accepted. He would preach in his church, which came with housing for the family. The house is listed at 258 Ryland Street as a 6-bedroom and 2 full bathrooms. God is good. Arletha was sometimes worried. Her husband reminded her, always keep the faith. Things were finally looking up for the Hopkins. By now, the Hopkins were still in Mobile, Alabama. They were very well respected, in and out of the church. Anthony had put together the Hopkins Ensemble. The children, they sing and they played their own instruments inside the church. Chantel and Tasha, along with Anthony's biological children, did whatever their father asked of them. The children were well-mannered, respected both their parents, and seemed to be examples of the church, a family that other families should take notice. Pastor Anthony Hopkins would use the Bible for everything. He would make sure his family lived by God's words. After all, Anthony had a direct line to God. You'd have to wonder, was Anthony's intentions always, or like so many, had he grown into the monster that he had become? Chantel was told the story of Lot by her father when she was just 11 years old. It was okay to have sex with her father. It was in the Bible. He described Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters climbed a mountain to take shelter in a cave. The eldest daughter gets her father drunk and has sex with him without his knowledge. It was right there in black and white in the Bible. So it must be true. And so she did it. But she couldn't tell anyone. It would be going against God if she did. It would be a sin. These feelings weighed on Chantel. At 11 years old, she didn't know what to do, and she couldn't tell anybody about it. During the day, she was the eldest sibling. She had to set examples and act accordingly for the younger ones, but at night, her father twisted words in the Bible to suit his sexual deviance towards his stepdaughter. Chantel didn't like it. She didn't want to go against God, but she wasn't sure if this was right. She was afraid, but she mustered up enough courage and confided in her mother and told her mother exactly what had been going on. I don't know how an 11-year-old girl with no outside influences explains to her mother that her father had been sexually abusing her. However, Chantel told. But she didn't believe her. Her cries had fell on deaf ears. If Arletha asked her husband about Chantel's accusations, he obviously didn't care. His wife didn't believe it anyway. For years, Chantel was raped nightly by her father. One day after church, Arletha would venture off looking for her husband, and she would open the bathroom door and witness her husband and daughter. Everything that her daughter had told her had been true. The devil had made him sin. He had a weak moment. Forgive him. God had already forgiven him. Don't break and split up the family. God needed this family to stay together. Anthony and Arletha Hopkins sought counseling to fix the marriage. He promised he would never touch Chantal again. But promises are made to be broken. The family, dressed in their Sunday best, listened to their father preach, followed by the Hopkins ensemble, who put on another great musical performance. There was an announcement awaiting from the First Lady of the church. After 10 years of marriage, the Hopkins were expecting their 8th addition, their ever-so-growing family. It was night and day at the Hopkins house. At night, Anthony and Arletha would bicker a lot. Most of the time, it was about her distrust of her husband. Though she didn't come right out and say it, that's what I believed it was. And Chantal, she still kept that burden. She wasn't going to confide in her mother again. He never stopped. There wasn't any purpose of telling her. What would be the end result? There weren't any end results. Nothing would change. Chantal did what her father said God told her to do. On November 21st, 2004, Arletha would give birth to a bouncing baby boy. The couple was overjoyed. The baby was supposed to take their minds off the stress and tension that had been inside the home for a while. Though the focus was supposed to be on the baby, Anthony's focus was still on his 16-year-old stepdaughter. On December 4th, 2004, the house was quiet. Arletha had awoken to her husband not in the bed with her. She went looking for him. Again, she had caught him yet again, locked in the bathroom with Chantal. Anthony and Arletha argued. The argument was different. The siblings referred to the argument as the big fight. Arletha had told Anthony she wanted him out the house. She didn't want him anymore. It was over. She was leaving him. She planned to go to the church and tell them everything that had been going on inside the home, especially what he had been doing with Chantal all these years. She told him that if he didn't leave, that she would call the police. He left, and she locked the door behind him. Anthony was fuming outside the home. He thought about it. She was going to tell his parishioners everything. They had grown with him, confided in him, trusted him. What were they going to say if they believed her? He'd lose everything. He may even go to jail. She couldn't ruin him. Everything he had worked so hard for? Why was she trying to ruin him? Anthony would tap on Chantal's bedroom window. She was startled, but she opened it up and allowed her father to gain entry back inside the home. Anthony immediately was back in the bedroom with Arletha. She was stunned that he was even back in the house. Not only was Chantal listening, but the other siblings were listening too. Some had even gotten a chance to see what was going on inside the room. You heard furniture moving, things breaking, and Arletha screaming, followed by, quote, "Help me, take me to the hospital, don't let me die," end quote. Chantal ran to the bedroom and she grabbed her newborn crying little brother and ran inside the bathroom and locked the door. She was scared. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. The following morning, Chantal was now at that very church that her father preached at, and they were digging the grave for her mother. One of the parishioners had came around the back of the church after seeing Anthony's van. He witnessed the pastor and Chantal standing there with shovels in their hands and a hole about 2 feet deep. Thinking quickly, Anthony said he had been asked to do some survey work from a fellow pastor and that his daughter was helping. Who would think anything other than that? The children were told if anyone asked, quote, "Your mother is at work. Your mother isn't feeling well. Your mother moved to Georgia. Your mother has abandoned the family," end quote. But that Sunday morning, Pastor Anthony Hopkins, overcome with grief, holding his infant son in his hands, started to cry. Standing in front of the congregation and all 7 of his children looking on, He announced that his wife had died during childbirth. There probably wasn't a dry eye in the church. The church had came to care for this family, and now this family was grieving. Pastor Hopkins, the widower, a man left to raise 8 children alone, he was going to do this all by himself. He was a pillar. Chantal would have to revisit her mother's grave. God had spoken again with Anthony. This time he wanted Arletha with the family. Chantal and her father had to dig up the body of her mother. Arletha's decomposing body, still wrapped in the bed sheets, was placed on a trailer connected to the van and brought home. Anthony had purchased a deep freezer prior and put it in the laundry room. Chantal helped lift her mother up and into the freezer. She wouldn't fit. As Chantal watched, Anthony got on top of the body, jumped up and down until Arletha was completely in, stuffing her hands inside and folding her arms in order to close the door. Church every Sunday, where the children played their instruments, homeschooling the children and teaching his children God's word and his word, living a life that God wanted his people to live, the stand-up man, a Christian man, a man of God. And at home, he could have his daughter any way he wanted without his pestering wife sneaking around the house. And that's what he did. Nobody gossips more than a congregation full of worshipers. His wife was sent back to be buried with her family. There was a small ceremony in New Orleans. Only family was invited. She's not dead. She actually had ran off and left him and the children. She's a seamstress for wealthy people in Hollywood. Pastor Jerry Porter had even made the mistake of asking Pastor Anthony Hopkins how come there wasn't a funeral and the congregation be invited. He was banned from the church and he could never come back. However, he said they remained friendly. He was even invited to Hopkins' home and he attended. When he left, there wasn't anything more that he could say. The children were nicely dressed, well behaved. He didn't see any stress. The house was clean and neat. Chantal was doing everything she could to lighten the load off of her father. It turns out Pastor Hopkins was a grieving man, and his wife's body 12 feet away. Another person had been inquiring about Arletha. Remember her stepmother, Mary Best? Anthony would make up lies as he went along. His wife was working, not feeling well, call back later, call back later. Then he just stopped answering the phone altogether. Mary Best assumed maybe Arletha didn't want to speak to her anymore. Certainly, she didn't understand why, but it stayed in the back of her mind, and she stopped calling. Years would go by. No one would be none the wiser. While the secret stayed frozen for years, shockingly, more secrets were coming out about Pastor Anthony.